And we're going to create an application that uses what's called a web view for one of its views. And we'll have various buttons hook up to that web view so that we can control a web browser on our mobile device. For the project name, I'm going to call it web browser. Make sure it's on the Swift language and that it's universal. I'm just going to save it in one of my folders. Here's the default interface for Xcode. You can see that this is our project settings for our project, and we can get to this by clicking on this blue icon. Our project name is web browser. We have our different targets, so when we compile the application, this is the application that we're going to create. And so for the display name, we have web browser. The bundle ID is a very unique identifier that identifies our application across the entire App Store. Version number is pretty self-explanatory. Our build number can be anything. Now when we're releasing to the App Store, that build number has to increase for each version of the application. We're not going to cover signing in this video, but signing is the way that we digitally sign an application so that it can go onto a device securely, and the user knows that it comes from you as a developer. The deployment information is down here, and we'll scroll down and see that. And the deployment target is saying that people with at least iOS 10 can install this application. But if you want to have people who have 9 installed, you can drop this down and select version 9. So anybody with iOS 9 and above can install our application. That's a pretty big population in terms of iOS. With the latest version and one previous version back, you'll cover about 80 to 90% depending upon how old iOS 10 is. After about 6 months, you'll probably get up to somewhere about 93, 94, 95% market share of iOS 9 users and iOS 10 users. We don't really have to go back too far, say iOS 8. Okay, that's all we're going to cover in the general properties. Let's go over to our main storyboard and jump into it. So when I click on our main storyboard file, we bring up this view controller. Our view controller is going to be the controller that handles our view. Now you can see this kind of looks like an iPhone interface. And we can drag buttons and other interface elements by going down here in the bottom right hand corner. Let's resize this a little bit. And let's filter down because there's a whole bunch of things we can add. I'm going to filter down and I'm going to look for a web view. And I'm going to click and drag this onto the screen and maybe center it and drag it down here. And just resize this to match the full screen here. Okay, well that doesn't look very good because it's just a white box on a white background. So let's take a look for that web view. We can click on this little slider looking icon and we can have all these different options. So scales page to view. So when we go to a web page, it'll scale the web page down so that it fits on the iPhone or iPad, depending upon which device this is on. And there's a bunch of other options that you can play around with, but the one thing I do want to do is resize this according to the size that it's going to be on the device. Now it looks like it's full screen right now, but what's going to happen is if this is on an iPad, which is a little bit wider than the iPhone, this view is going to stay the same size. Or if it's on a view that's a little bit smaller, it's going to have margins on either side. And so we want this to scale both vertically and horizontally. And the way that we do this is we hold down the control key and left mouse click from our view that we want to resize to the container view. And so in this case, from this highlighted view here up to this container view, release, and we want to say that the vertical space to the top layout guide is going to be constant. So if I click this, you can see a little tiny bar connected here and said, I want just this amount of space from the top always. Now we can't do that on the left side and the right side in order to make that full width, nor the bottom, because we can't grab, if we control click down, I can't quite drag it to the container view. And so what I'm going to do instead is from this web view that I'm currently selected on, I'm going to go up to our view, and this is the container view. This is the hierarchy view of what we're looking at on our storyboard. So if I release it here, I get that same menu. And so I'm going to do leading space to container margin, and that's actually going to take care of this left or leading edge. And then for the trailing edge, I'm going to do the same thing, but I'm going to start over here and do web view, again holding down the control key, click, and then drag straight up to our view, do the trailing space, and then for the bottom, as you can see, it add this little bar or strut here, and for the bottom, again control click and drag here, and the vertical spacing to the bottom. And what that'll do is add this blue line, if you can see that. As this outer view or container view resizes, either gets wider or taller, our child view, namely the web view, will resize to always fit the width and the height of our view. So play around with that and see what effects not setting the trailing, leading, top and bottom constraints lead to, and just have fun with it. Okay, if we go ahead and compile our application, you can see what we see is what we get. And so that's not very interesting. What we have to do is set up an initial URL to go to for this web browser. So I'm going to click and drag this over here, or I can scroll this window over here, and go to our assistant view. So by clicking this button in the top right hand corner, you can see that we have our code on our right and this view on our left, and this view corresponds to this code. How do I know that? Because if I click on this and I go over to our properties here, I can see that the class that's associated with it is namely view controller, and that's exactly our class name here. It's not a very descriptive name, so maybe you can rename that later, but we'll just stick with view controller for now. Now in view controller, we want to tell via code that our web view needs to go to a particular URL. So how do we do that? Usually what you need to do is get a reference in your code to the web view that's in our interface. With Android and with JavaScript and a bunch of other languages, what you normally do is give this element an ID and then you refer to that ID here. With Swift and Xcode, what you do is you control click from your view that you care about, that you want a reference to, over to your code. It'll pop up this little menu, and the connection is going to be an outlet. So it's going to be an outlet from your code to this view. We're just going to call this WebView. And you can see that the type is of type UIWebView, and that's great. We'll talk about storage a little bit later in probably another video, but this refers to who actually owns the code or the memory of this variable. And so, in other words, our class did not necessarily construct the view, the storyboard did. So the storyboard owns that memory, and so when things get freed up and that sort of thing, we're saying that this view controller doesn't really own that particular piece of memory. Don't worry about it right now. Usually outlets are always weak, and so we're just going to accept the default and hit connect. And so now we have a reference to our code. Let's leave a little space here. We have this attribute called IBOutlet that stands for Interface Builder Outlet. Again, that weak connection. It's a variable, and it's called WebView of type UIWebView. And that's all we need for right now. In our viewDidLoad method, this is kind of like our entry point into our view controller. It's one of the first methods to get called after everything in our view has, well, loaded. And so we're going to start here with our web view. Let's go down here, make a new line, and say WebView dot. And we want this to load a request, namely the URL that we want to navigate to. So because this is an object-oriented language, this load request is going to require another object, namely URLRequest. So let's go ahead and select that first one because that's the one we want. And you can see the parameter that it's needing is of type URLRequest. Well, we don't have that. We can't just put a string in here. We have to actually create an object. And so I'll leave that right now as is. Go up above here, create a new variable, again using the let keyword. And we're going to navigate to the electronic armory URL. And that's going to be of type URLRequest. And actually I'm going to make this URLRequest type just to be consistent. And running out of space, so I already have that. Let's go ahead and close this, go to our view controller so we have a little bit more real estate. Okay, so we're going to begin our constructor again, URLRequest, begin parenthesis, and now we have two options here. And the first one's just going to be the easier one, so I can do that. We have a little bit more control with how the iOS application is going to cache our request, and if we're going to have a timeout, say don't wait more than 10 seconds or something like that. So again, I'm just going to use that first one. And again, we can't just put in a string here, it's going to request a URL. And so what I'm going to do is construct that URL. And I'm going to copy this one, paste it above. And instead of a URL request, it's going to be a URL and URL. And it's a constructor. And I'm going to find the one that takes a string as a parameter. And that string is going to be electronicarmory.com. Okay, and if we hold down Control and /, it goes to the next placeholder where we have our URL. So Electronic Armory, URL, and again, Control / to select the next placeholder, which is request URL request. Now we have that again. Select this one. All right, now Xcode is complaining that we have an error on this line of code, and that's fine. What I forgot to do is this constructor, say if this parameter is a bad parameter, it's not a well-formed URL, it'll actually return something other than a URL object, namely nil or something like that. You'd probably have to check the documentation to see exactly what it returns, but let's just assume it's nil. This is not safe. We can't just use it, but for sake of this tutorial and sake of speed, I'm going to assume that what I typed in here is proper. So normally you'd want to do some error handling here just in case that what that was typed in wasn't correct, or let's say you got that from a configuration file or user input and that sort of thing. You want to do some error handling on that. However, I'm going to assume that that's correct, but what it's asking for is this is a optional variable which contains a wrapper, and that wrapper kind of protects that variable. It could be a nil inside of it, and so it's more of an object-oriented way of handling something that comes back as nil, because nil is not an object, it's just basically zero, it's nothing. So we have to assume in this case that it is not nil, and so I'm going to what's called unwrap this variable to basically take that wrapper away and expose the inner variable, namely the data that we're looking for, and so this is that URL object. And if I didn't do that, if I didn't put the exclamation point, and go back to the error that Xcode built up here. So I hit Command B to bring that error back up. So if you ever see a stop sign with a circle in it, that's telling you that Xcode is offering to help you out with your code. And so if you click on this, it'll open up a fix it option, and we can double click on this to insert the fix for us. Okay, and so now we have a reference to our interface object, namely our WebView. We're taking a URL, so a representation of the string as an object. We're forming a request from that object, and this request is going to be a GET request on this URL, and that's hopefully going to return that web page. And we're going to load that request in our WebView, and that's going to display our page in our iOS application. And so let's compile that and see what that looks like. As you can see, nothing came up with our application because if we look in our output, it says Transport Security has blocked a clear text HTTP resource since it is insecure. Anytime that you request an HTTP resource, namely a website that doesn't have SSL or HTTPS, you're going to get this error. And so what it's saying is temporary exceptions can be configured via your app's info.plist file. All right, so how do we change this? Well, we can either add HTTPS here if your site supports it. So for example, HTTPS, and let's change this to apple.com, rerun this. And you see, just by changing it to HTTPS, it takes that request in our application. Okay, but what if you really wanted your own application? So let's undo that. Now, it says we have to do the exception in our info plist. Our info plist is located here in our files, and we have a whole bunch of options here, and these options are actually represented in XML. This is just a nice way of viewing that XML. To add a new value in here, we go down to the bottom and hit the plus, and we have a whole bunch of options we can select. I'm going to start typing this in as NSAppTransport. Hit this disclosure arrow to open this up, but there's no items below it, and so once that disclosure arrow is open by pointing down, now if we hit the plus button, we can do this. And we want to allow arbitrary loads. This is just a temporary solution. I think if you really just wanted to load in one website or one resource, you can actually add exception domains to this. Hit enter, you can see that now we have a disclosure arrow. Okay, so you can add your exception domains here, namely your website. But I'm just going to go ahead and, with this still pointing down direction, hit the plus key, allow arbitrary loads. This will just let us add whatever we want. It's a boolean. Right now it's no, and we want to switch that to yes. So essentially that's saying yes, allow arbitrary loads. If we go back to our view controller just to double check that electronicarmory.com is selected, we don't support HTTPS yet on that website, so let me remove that and either hit the play button or Command R. Switch over to our application and see our website load up here. You don't want to just opt out and just say, just load whatever you want. You really need to be secure. Make sure your resources are under HTTPS. If you don't want to go through the trouble of setting up SSL, what you can do is put files or resources under maybe an S3 bucket or an Azure Blob service, because those services already enable SSL for you. Okay, so this is great for a web browser. Let's go ahead and go back to our code. Let's go to the assistant, because I want to add one more thing. So hit the main storyboard. Now I'm going to resize this a little bit and make some room at the top. Now you see everything turns orange because what you see is not representative of what's compiled. If I recompile this, you'll see it return back to the normal full screen, not what I've set here, and that's what the orange shows. And so when you see the orange, what you can do is you can go down here, go down to this triangle with the two bars on the either end, and you can say, if you scroll down here, I can say for this selected view, namely the web view, I can either update the frame or update the constraints. I want to update the constraints because I don't want the constraints to be full screen. I want the constraints to be what the frame looks like. So hit constraints, and now you can see that our space is constant. Everything's blue. Everything looks good. So perfect. I'm going to add some buttons. Go down to button. And I'm going to add a button up here and a button over here on the left. Match those up, maybe give it some space. And this one's going to be a back button. And this one's going to be a forward button. Okay, and these will correspond to back and forward on our web browser. Just make sure those look good. And now control, click and drag for the leading space so that sticks to the left-hand side. Control drag up here to vertical space so that sticks up there. You can see those lines. This line is basically telling it's going to stay on the left. This line's going to be on the top. We're going to do likewise for the forward button, vertical space, and to the trailing edge, we want it to stick to that right-hand side. So trailing space to container margin. And there we go. So we don't necessarily need a reference to these buttons because we don't want to change the buttons themselves, but we want the buttons to act as action items. And so if we scroll down a little bit below our methods and I control, click and drag down below here, I don't want to add an outlet. I actually want to make this into an action. And this action is when I click this button, it's going to call this function or this method. And so I'm going to say go forward. And the touch up inside, so when the finger comes up from the button on the inside of the button, not outside, it'll do this action for us. So there's go forward, and we're going to do the same thing for go back. So click and drag and let's put it above this one. We're going to call this method go back. It is of type UI button, but that's because it's an outlet. We want to switch that to an action. So now we have that touch up event inside. We have a bunch of different events that we can look at for different events. Okay, so connect that. So what happens when we hit the go back button? Well, when the go back button gets hit, let's click on this view and go to view controller so we have more screen real estate. Maybe close some of these windows. And in our go back method, we want to tell the web view, hey web view, go back. And for this one, web view, go forward. And that's it. Let's go ahead and compile that. Okay, so here's our basic web browser. If we click on go forward or hit the forward button, Obviously we have no history, so nothing happens, and if we go back, nothing happens. But let's go ahead and try to learn about electrical engineering. Okay, so we navigated to another page, and if we hit back, it goes back, and if we hit forward, it goes forward. And so that's the basics of storyboards and view controllers. Hopefully you found this tutorial interesting. If you'd like to see more tutorials on iOS, be sure to subscribe to the channel, hit us up on Facebook or electronicarmory.com, and we'll see you next time.